Hi, welcome to Cloud on Air, live webinars from Google. We are hosting webinars daily. This show is Ask the Experts. My name is Jay Smith, and today I have
Rob Hilton.
Yep, today we're going to be talking about migrations and hybridization. You can ask questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. So let's get started.
Sounds good.
A lot of people, Rob, are trying to migrate to the cloud, and they're tired about migrating to the cloud. Cloud technology has been around for a while, but a lot of people are kind of confused about it. So, can we tell them what are some of the benefits of migrating to the cloud versus staying in their data center, staying on-prem, as some would call it?
Absolutely. That's a great question to open with, because I think it's one of the first things that we evaluate when we talk about designing our applications. And I think it comes down to three important things. I'm going to start with management. And whenever I talk about management, I'm talking predominantly about the deployment of an application. I think what's important to consider is how much time you spend in the lifecycle of the application doing deployment and operations. And one of the first things that cloud enables us to do is ease that management, abstract some of it away, so that now, instead of deploying out an operating system, deploying out a hypervisor infrastructure, then managing the operating system and deploying the application on top of it, I can spend time focused on quickly and seamlessly spinning up instances, automating the installations of applications, and then scaling them. So the very first thing that we see is that it becomes much easier to deploy an application and manage the life cycle of that infrastructure in a cloud ecosystem.
Nice.
Plus, it gives us the ability to scale much more elastically, which I think is an incredibly powerful tool. But deployment is only one piece of it, which leads me to the second part, which is operations. How do you manage the ongoing life of that application? And cloud tools enable a lot of other things related to the operational lifecycle of an application. How can we do things like move an application from region to region? How can we load balance different portions of a user space to different portions of an application? These are tools that are native to cloud infrastructure. And all of the fun things that we talk about with CI/CD pipelines and DevOps become instantaneously enabled in the cloud ecosystem. Things like blue-green deployments, canary rollouts, alterations of portions of an application, as well as rollbacks if we run into failures. So cloud and the elasticity and scale of the cloud allows us to automate most of those things that we would be spending time doing on-prem. But there's also another more subtle one that I think is interesting, and that's user experience. If we think about what happens when a user accesses an application, there's almost a logical flow in terms of how the user experiences that app. So it makes sense, if it's a regional application or a global application, to have that centralized in a scaled location and enabling users to get access to that application in a space that makes the most sense. Whereas certain applications that might make more sense being closer or within the locality of an on-prem data center or edge space, those applications fit very well there. So when we think about how we design an application for cloud or for on-prem, I like to break it down into its component pieces and ask myself, how are my end users going to have the best experience before I roll out and manage this application?
Yep, absolutely. And kind of mixed in all there, so some of the cost savings, when you're talking about scaling, let's say it's Cyber Monday, I'm a retail outlet, I'm online, all of a sudden people start hammering my site. I don't want it to go down and risk my business, so I'll have to buy a bunch of servers, have them on standby. Yep. Even when they're not being used, I still spent money on them. Then at some point I have to deprecate the hardware, buy something more advanced, buy 3, 4, 5 years, whatever the time frame might be. With the cloud, it's kind of use it as you need it, scale as you need it, scale back down. You kind of only spend what you need.
Absolutely. I think that retail use case is a fantastic example, because I think it's a good example of the way applications are being re-architected with cloud in mind. Much smaller pieces, much more scalable pieces. I think another great example of the type of management advantage you can get from the cloud ecosystem is something like no ops or no operations, where certain cloud products are designed to almost entirely mitigate a lot of the infrastructure management that you would need to do. A good example is something like Hadoop, where you're used to deploying out a bunch of hardware, installing a Hadoop cluster, managing the operating system and software lifecycle of that cluster, and a small percentage of your time is actually spent on coding pipelines and batch jobs. for your big data ecosystem. Whereas with a product like Cloud Data Proc or Cloud Data Flow, you can minimize all of that infrastructure lifecycle management and actually focus on coding and development for your big data and analytics pipelines.
Yep.
It's a fantastic example, I think.
Great.
I think I talked a little bit about what it means to re-architect an application for the cloud, so I think my question to you is going to be, what are the recommended steps for migrating an application from a traditional on-prem environment to the cloud?
Absolutely, that's actually a really good question. So Google, if you look at our cloud site, we actually break it down into 5 steps. The first step is assess. You really want to kind of take pen to paper in this situation. You don't want to just say, okay, we're moving to the cloud, and then just start trying to move stuff, spin up instances, whatever the case might be. You want to know what you have today, and if you can move to the cloud. Maybe there's a business case why you need to keep something on-prem. Maybe it's a licensing issue. Whatever the case might be, figure out what you can move to the cloud and what you can't, and what will that look like. Okay, so I have VMs today, so let's just use VMs here. Or I'm using Kubernetes today, let's use Kubernetes here. I'm using Hadoop, whatever the case might be. The next step we call pilot, and this is kind of testing things. After you do the assessment, you don't want to just go ahead and migrate your entire workload into the cloud. You want to try it out first and familiarize yourself, especially if you haven't used the product yet. If you've never used Google Cloud Platform, it makes sense to take a look at it and get familiar with the CLI, the console, everything that is available to you, and see how you can optimize your experience. And see how it will look on the cloud, how it will run on the cloud if you need to make any adjustments. So that'd be the next step. So after that, it's move data. Now, a lot of people are going to tell you should move your application first. Well, we recommend moving the data first because 1, a lot of people have a lot of it, but then 2, most of your applications have a lot of dependencies on that data. So we recommend moving the data first, figuring out what kind of data you need to move. Object storage, do you have MySQL databases? Are you using mainly NoSQL? Whatever the case might be, what does that data look like today? And then how are you going to move it? Is it going to be a streaming job, a batch job? Are you going to have to ship a bunch of disks over? Whatever the case is. The next step is finally moving the actual application. How are you going to do that? Can it be a simple lift and shift? Are you going to just kind of do a rolling deployment or something to that effect? Then the last stage, optimize. So once you're on the cloud, it's not set and done. There's a lot of optimization you can do. Maybe there's tools you can utilize today that will reduce your cost, increase your experience, whatever the case. So we have a tool called Stackdriver, for example, that can let you do tracing, profiling, see where your application might be getting hung up, where processes might be experiencing latency. You can make improvements, whether it be increasing resources in a specific region or adding a new load balancer. You can collect all that information and start optimizing your experience on the cloud. Because one of the big reasons, as we mentioned, moving to the cloud is that you have this ability to scale and optimize in a way you don't necessarily on-prem. So now that you have these abilities open to you, you're going to want to take advantage of them.
Yeah, I think it's probably safe to assume that an application probably differs after migration little by little. I mean, everybody's talking about iteration and agility, and I think cloud is a pristine example of how you can make an application grow with your user base.
Yep, absolutely. So we're talking about migration, we're talking about on-prem, we're talking about data centers, and when people have these conversations, what usually comes up is the hybrid cloud. And while it might be a little bit of a loaded question, Rob, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the hybrid cloud is?
I can do my best. This is a big question with a lot of nuanced answers, so what I think I might do is I might start with describing the way I think about the hybrid cloud, because there's no single good answer for this. But whenever I think of my previous roles in technology spaces, I usually think about it almost in 2 buckets. If I'm going to deploy an application or operate an application, I think about either putting that application in the public cloud or in an on-prem data center or a private cloud. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the entirety of an application per se. It can be portions of an application. But the point is, what I am thinking about is portions of it go here on-prem, portions of it go in the public cloud, and it's my responsibility to manage which of those buckets portions of my applications live in. One could argue that if you design an application this way, that is kind of hybrid cloud. But I think there's more nuance to it. I think the most important thing about the cloud ecosystem is the idea of abstraction. So I think once we understand that there are two components, there's an on-prem component and a public cloud component, we think about how to abstract that requirement, minimize the amount of effort that I, as an operator, have to put into deciding which components of an application go in which bucket. And I think that's where we see some of the really, really cool application components and innovations like microservices and CI/CD that allow us to abstract as much of that away from the developer or the operator as possible. So the more you climb up the stack, the more hybrid cloud becomes about how can I abstract away the entirety of those infrastructure components and make it so it doesn't matter where I orchestrate, and that whatever is best for my application is what happens. So I think, to me, that's what hybrid cloud is about. Abstracting this idea of on-prem and public cloud and making it one abstracted infrastructure that changes and moves dynamically and allows parts of your application to be, as I mentioned earlier, where the best fit is for the end user.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of to the first point, you know, when we talked about the Cyber Monday in the retail store, maybe you have a business case for having the application hosted on-prem, but what happens when that traffic comes? You can now burst out to the cloud. You know, if you start seeing the cloud as, or the hybrid cloud environment as just one infrastructure instead of, well, I've got some workloads on-prem and some workloads in the cloud. If you just see it as one thing, then you're able to get the most out of it.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of interesting, so I talk about the nuance, and I think a good way to think about it is if I have two portions of an application, one in public cloud, one on-prem, and I burst to the cloud, I think we start to see some of the challenges inherent in hybrid clouds, such as how do I make sure that even though I have portions of my application in the public cloud, that I'm load balanced effectively? How do I automate all of those things like ingress and migration of application components? How do I make it behave like one congruent unit? And I think that's where it gets really, really interesting, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the innovations in the cloud ecosystem. Yeah, and I also think it's really important to consider application design. I think there are portions of an application that make logical sense to be in a public cloud where you can get all the horsepower of the infrastructure, and there are portions of an application that may make sense to be on-prem or closer to the edge. I think my favorite example of this is an IoT machine learning use case. Trying to train on all the data that comes with a distributed IoT application, it's really hard to do that on-prem just because of the horsepower required. So you have this big, elastically scalable public cloud infrastructure that you can use for training. But if it's an IoT use case or an edge use case, you can actually take that model once it's trained and move it down toward the edge or on-prem for actual inference. And then we can ask ourselves, how can we automate that entire process so that it requires less user interaction? And that's where the fun of hybrid cloud comes into play.
Yes, machine learning is actually an amazing use case for that, since especially a lot of the devices have to use the model on the edge, as you mentioned, but you can't really train the model effectively on my phone or whatever the case might be.
So we've talked a little bit about hybrid cloud, and we've talked a little bit about what an early design and migration might look like. So Jay, what are your opinions on some best practices to consider when you're moving an application?
So we talked a little bit about the steps earlier. So I would also always consider those steps, but if we want to do a deeper dive on some of the best practices, there's a lot of stuff that can be talked about regarding, say, permissions. So it's not unusual to see somebody actually just kind of give wide open permissions on the cloud because they don't want to deal with the access management or anything, but you really don't do that with your internal LDAP. You usually have permissions to make sure somebody has access to one thing and somebody has access to something. You want to make sure somebody only has access to what they need. You don't want somebody to delete a resource but then accidentally check another resource and ruin another team's day or week. So, you know, that's something you really want to consider. A lot of times you can just emulate what you have in today's organization structure with your LDAP and move it to the cloud. We actually have like an LDAP transfer system that you can use. But that's definitely something you need to consider, and it's easier to, in my opinion, for you to think about it before you start loading resources than to load resources and then now trying to figure out who has access to what.
Yeah, I actually think that's a really fantastic example, is understanding like identity management and how it applies in a cloud context. Usually infrastructure is much simpler in the cloud, and arguably with simplicity comes a certain degree of danger.
Yes.
So making sure that principle of least privilege is overlaid is actually a really incredible example of what should be, I think, front of mind.
Yep. Yeah. And then there's other things to consider too, because we're talking about hybridization, we're talking about migration. Sometimes there's things that just can't be migrated to the cloud for whatever reason. A lot of times licensing comes into play and it makes it difficult to move certain pieces of software to the cloud. Sometimes there might be regulations that require you to keep stuff on premise. Whatever the case might be, you definitely want to assess and take a look and see what can be moved to the cloud and what can't. If you can't move something to the cloud, then figure out how it can work together with the stuff that you can move to the cloud. Because there's no point in making an exercise of trying to move something to the cloud that you can't.
Yeah.
And for the stuff that depends on the things that you weren't able to move to the cloud, you want to make sure that they're able to communicate and still work without any kind of interruption or unnecessary latency or whatever the case might be. So that's definitely another thing worth considering when moving to the cloud. Also, you want to figure out your teams and sponsorship internally. This kind of goes more towards the business side of things, away from the tech, but before you move to the cloud, you want to make sure you know what everybody needs inside of the organization with the teams and what they don't need. And make sure that everybody is ready for the migration as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So one of the first things we talked about was identity management.
Yes.
So I'm going to level another hard one at you. Security.
Yes.
So what's your take on security in the cloud and how you can ensure that your data is safe? I get to ask him the hard ones.
Yeah, this one's actually a really interesting question, and it's probably been an issue since public cloud became a thing, because people say, well, hey, I don't want to give my data to a third party. I want to keep it all in-house. And I understand the logic behind that. But realistically, there are a lot of bad actors out there, a lot of hackers, phishing, all of that exists. And they are constantly finding new ways to break into software. I mean, I don't know how many security updates I get on my applications on a given day.
Yeah.
So that is a lot of work for your resources to try to work to figure out, especially on an infrastructure level. And then, of course, there's issues with compliance. Depending on what business you're in, there's different certifications, compliance, regulations. Where do you want to do business? The regulations in this country might not be the same in this country. So now you have these 2, 3, whatever buckets that you're having to worry about when it comes to compliance. So that's a task in and of itself too. So really you want to partner with somebody who's solved a lot of these problems. So Google, being as big as it is and being around as long as it has had a lot of people try to break into it. And through the years, we have improved our network and have improved our hardware. Really, we've done the whole stack. I mean, even on the hardware level, we have chips on our machines that prevent people from breaking in.
Yeah.
Just chips dedicated to that purpose. And we also have a lot of other forms of encryption that we are utilizing, and scanners and whatnot. And then, of course, when we're talking about compliance, yes, there's a technological aspect, but there's also the legal aspect. So we also have the legal expertise to help you solve that. And trying to take that on yourself is very time consuming. You definitely want to partner with somebody who knows how to do this. Now, when it comes to actually using the cloud, we encrypt everything at rest and in transit. We also have things like the identity-aware proxy, which allows login to the VMs that are secure. We also have the IAM, which is what gives you the different levels of access management and identity, and it keeps people out who don't need to be in and keeps them out of certain aspects of the cloud. You can even, for your applications, create service accounts, which can only do 1 or 2 functions. So that way, when you give an application access, if somebody were to break into it, they couldn't use it to delete all your databases. So we have those features as well. We also have a key management service. You know, if you have SSH keys, we have a variety of products around that. I encourage you to go to cloud.google.com/security to see all of them. And I would add /compliance to that if you want to see all of our certifications. There are a lot of them, and we don't want to list them all here because...
You should try.
No, we should try, but I'm pretty sure everybody here will fall asleep if I did. But yes, and if you have any high-level questions about security, please reach out to one of us. You know, we're customer engineers. There are plenty of them around here. Reach out to any one of us, and we can definitely link you up to one of our security experts, where all they do is look at security and compliance. So they can definitely have those deeper conversations about your specific needs and am I HIPAA compliant, am I PCI, whatever the certification you're looking at. Can I do my business in Japan with their laws? We definitely have the experts on hand to help you. It's like I mentioned earlier, I mean, when you're looking for a cloud provider, you're really not just looking for a service provider. You're not looking for somebody to just host your data. You're really looking for a partner in your business's growth. And that's kind of how we see ourselves at Google. We see ourselves as a partner in your growth. So we definitely want to help you secure your application and make sure all of these concerns are addressed.
Yeah, I think that's a huge and exciting point. Like the same security that we provide to our subscribers and our users is the same security that we've built over time for our end users. So all of those lessons that we've learned from effectively being at the forefront of indexing the internet are now security best practices and compliance practices that our users can effectively leverage without going through the process on their own.
Yep, you're definitely leveraging a lot of our knowledge and experience over the past 20 some odd years.
Yeah.
Well, you know, now that we're talking about hybridization, we're talking about migration, we're talking about the cloud, let's talk a little bit about cloud native. You know, that's a big word nowadays. And what the most, I guess, practical application of that today is the Kubernetes.
Yes.
Kubernetes platform or application, however you want to call it, framework. So I guess the question here is, how is Kubernetes a great option for migration and hybridization?
Yes, that is probably my favorite question to answer because Kubernetes is one of my favorite platforms. I think it is done a lot in re-architecting the way we design applications and think about different application pieces. But I do want to caveat that by saying, especially when we talk about cloud native, it's very, very, very important to realize that it does change the way you have to look at the deployment and lifecycle of an overarching application. So I'll start at the beginning, and I think a good example of how this applies is what Kubernetes actually does and what containerization actually does. As application architects and operators, we typically think about applications in the framework of a VM. Where you have a complete operating system, a whole bunch of underlying runtimes, as well as processes all segmented within a security perimeter. And what containerization in Kubernetes actually does is it shrinks that perimeter down to a specific process or set of processes and allows you to orchestrate and control those logical pieces of an application independently. So it's a really subtle change. It shrinks the pieces by which you normally think about the architecture of an application, but it gives you a massive amount of power. The way I like to think about Kubernetes as an orchestrator is if you envision the process table on something like a Windows machine or a Linux machine. You have these dozens of different processes, all of which are performing an individual service. What if you could take one of those processes, like for example, a front-end web server or a process that's doing scheduling or something along those lines. And what if you could take that individual process and scale it horizontally across lots of different compute nodes? Effectively, that's what Kubernetes is doing, is it's a distributed, almost process-like table, because those individual pieces are so small that they're able to pick up and move and spin down. We're talking about effectively portions of an application in the megabytes of size, as opposed to what we're used to thinking about in gigabits or gigabytes. So I think what makes that really interesting is it means we can spin up new portions of the application in milliseconds as opposed to minutes. And that gives us an easy way to do things like load balance across all of those different individual services. And Kubernetes is also a standards-based API, which means that no matter where it exists, it could be on-prem, it could be in GCP using something like Google Kubernetes Engine,
Right.
Another managed service that we offer for quickly and easily spinning up Kubernetes infrastructures. At the end of the day, it's still a singular API, and that means that it's a standard in the way you communicate with it. So you can orchestrate application portions to different Kubernetes clusters in different locations, in different regions, and then you can do things like pick up portions of the application and easily move them from place to place. So Kubernetes is a way to miniaturize applications and then seamlessly and dynamically spin them up and change their locations and do things like canary testing and load balancing. It's a much different way to think about platform orchestration, and it's a phenomenal way to go toward cloud native and still have all the knobs to tune and tweaks that you need to put in place that Kubernetes provides as a platform.
Yeah, and like you mentioned with the standard API, I can host Kubernetes on Google, I can host Kubernetes on-prem, I can host it anywhere, and it's standard. It's that layer of abstraction for your developers. So I don't have to teach my developers or my ops team two different systems for us to develop our application, one that we use on-prem and one that we use on the cloud. We can just have one standard across the board, which is great.
Yeah. A good way to think about the way you would design is that if we take a standard 3-tier web application and we break it down to its logical parts, we have effectively a front-end web server component of the application. We have a logic portion of the application, but we also might have something like a scheduler, or we might have something like an analytics framework.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that is they're both going to have different utilization and resource requirements. So if we break them down into their individual pieces, we allow things like our web server front end to scale independent of the way our logic backend scales, or to be located in different places depending on the needs of the application. So I think that kind of thought process about becoming cloud native and the way you design your application really is amazing when you think about how Kubernetes can enable those functions.
Absolutely. And you mentioned GKE, our managed Kubernetes engine, and one thing I think we should talk about when we're talking about migrating to cloud is managed services. We're talking about best practice, we're talking about migrating. One of the benefits of moving to the cloud is that we have a lot of products that we manage that you just worry about using. So let's take Cloud SQL, for example. It's a managed MySQL. So if you're today managing MySQL database or a series of MySQL databases, you don't really necessarily need to or want to focus your developers' time on making sure that the database is up, making sure that the server is patched, whatever that is. You want them to just use it, and you want to know that it's there and it's reliable. So maybe it makes more sense for you to pass that along to somebody else to manage. You use Cloud SQL instead of managing it yourself. And then we have a variety of them. I mean, you mentioned Dataproc, which is a managed Hadoop. And that's using managed services are absolutely a good benefit of the cloud.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing thing. Like, I think the heart of it all is abstracting and automating as much infrastructure as possible. Just making it so that our developers and end users consume the most scalable application they can with the least amount of effort. And also being able to iterate and change that application over time as painlessly as possible.
Yes, yeah. And again, infrastructure, it's necessary. We talk about the cloud, but it's not like your applications are literally floating in the air. It is still hosted on servers and VMs and whatever the case.
You mean they're not in a literal cloud?
We did try to launch that once, but it didn't really work out.
It's on the roadmap.
Yeah, apparently apps are not water friendly, so we're still trying to figure that out. Maybe dry ice or something.
Oh, yeah, we could take that to product.
Right, but yeah, so a lot of people do still want to manage the infrastructure. They still think about it because that is how they've had to do it in terms of legacy applications. That's how they've had to do it for years. Really, when you step back and think about it, do you really need to manage the application? Like, is that actually making your is managing the infrastructure making your application better? Is it making you any money? It's not. Oftentimes it's just busy work, and your developer's time could be better spent actually building the application, improving the application, scaling the application, new features.
Yeah, I think a statistic I had heard is that something like a third of a developer's time on average is spent effectively being an amateur systems engineer, which is arguably not the best use of their time. And I think Kubernetes is interesting as a platform because it does provide all the benefits of a managed service, but it does enable some degree of tweaking that developers can do, things that are relevant.
Right.
I think that's an interesting question whenever I talk about applications, is what types of things are relevant to a developer as they're building an application. I would argue that to some degree, things like load balancing and the way traffic is ingested is relevant, but you don't necessarily want to have your developer be familiar with a traditional load balancer and have to go in and deploy it by hand. So Kubernetes exposes an API that developers can use that enable them to exercise some control over that load balancing functionality without actually needing to go in and learn about it and understand it and be a systems engineer. So I think Kubernetes walks that fine line between being a managed service and enabling some degree of infrastructure modification.
Yep. Takes infrastructure to code.
Yes.
Infrastructure as code to a new level too, because it is all just essentially YAML files.
Yes,
that
exactly.
You're controlling it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, this has been a great talk.
It has.
And I hope you guys definitely learned a lot more about migrating and hybridization. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit Cloud OnAir to discover more content from Google experts.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.